We're back again with more Marvel's Avengers, a game whose outlook continues to look pretty dire, and things get more dire by the day. They're currently so focused on fixing the game that a lot of the new content that was supposed to come out has been delayed. The core game itself has not been particularly well received. I mean, just looking at Metacritic, PlayStation 4 version, which has the most reviews from 91 critics, 67 Metascore, 5.0 user score. And what's especially telling is the number of reviews, which usually can indicate how popular a game is. The fact that an Avengers game, a AAA Avengers game, only has 2,000 ratings here on Metacritic, and the PC version only has 261 ratings, and the Xbox One version only has 256, is especially telling about the general interest surrounding this game, which is not a whole lot because at the end of the day, it's just so unfortunately generic. And looking at Steam charts, you can really see the downwards trend of this game. Back in October 9th, 2020, I published the following video in which I talked about the dying player base and how back then the 24-hour peak was at almost 2,000 players, and in the last 14 hours, around 1,500 players had tuned in. This was back in October. Those numbers were pretty dire as they were, and looking at the graph here, if you looked at the lowest point, you could see the numbers actually dipping below 1,000. And then, fast forward to November 10th, 2020, so about a month later, and the number had sunk significantly. So, whereas before we had 1,400 and 2,000 roughly there, now we're looking at numbers in 500 an hour ago as of the recording of this video, which was later in the night, which is when there's less players, and then the 24-hour peak was sitting at 717 players. Which finally brings us to today. Looking at Steam charts now, unfortunately, will reveal that that trend continues to go down with a 24-hour peak of 648 players, and at some of the lower points, you can see that numbers can sink well into the low 300s. I suspect that this is going to start dipping into the 200s pretty soon, unless the developers get something out right quick. New content that will really bolster the game and breathe new life to it. The thing is, while there is new content coming, I don't suspect it'll be enough to make people who've already left the game return. That new content, I think, will end up appealing to the minority who did stick around and who find some enjoyment out of this game. And just to give you an idea for how dire the situation is, 648 24-hour peak. That is less than what The Division accomplished in the last 24 hours, 937 players. And keep in mind, this is a game that came out back in March 2016, and it had 113,000 peak when it came out. Marvel's Avengers had a peak of only 28,000 players when it first came out. And looking at these numbers right here and calculating the percentage, we're essentially looking at a game that has lost 98% of its player base on Steam. It's hard to say how it's performing on Xbox One and PlayStation 4, but I would surmise that numbers aren't looking all that great there either. I would surmise that even on consoles, a significant number of players have just kind of moved on from this generic title. I can only assume that the PlayStation 4 version is the most popular one, given that that's where Spider-Man's going to be and it has the greater number of user reviews. Even on that platform, I would surmise that things aren't going all that well, given reports of matchmaking issues caused by the diminishing player base. In fact, news outlet Forbes, as I mentioned in previous videos, reported on the PC version's player base dipping below 1,000, causing matchmaking problems. I cannot begin to imagine what matchmaking problems look like now with only 648 players at its peak, and with the player base dipping into the low 300s when the player base is at its least active. Like, that's just not enough players to sustain a live service like Marvel's Avengers, one that is so heavily focused on cooperative multiplayer experience. You add that on top of the fact that Square Enix has reported losses of somewhere between $48 million and $63 million, depending on who you ask, because of Marvel's Avengers' tepid launch, because sales weren't as high as they were hoping, only selling like 3.3 million units, which I think is actually even less than Anthem, and this is a known brand, it's Avengers. For an Avengers AAA game to sell that low is kind of shocking. Marvel's Spider-Man performed better and it was only out on one platform. Not to mention that Marvel's Avengers is cutting prices on microtransactions, which suggests that that's not performing as well as they'd like. And content, as I mentioned before, for Kate Bishop and Clint, aka Hawkeye, have been delayed, though Kate Bishop is coming out soon in December, which I'll get to in a bit. And then beyond that, the PlayStation 5 and Series X versions of the game were delayed to next year. And obviously with the performance of Marvel's Avengers being called into question on current-gen consoles with frame rates dipping and being so stuttery that for me it actually made me feel motion sick playing the game. You know, a next-gen version would be ideal, but that's not coming out anytime soon either because of the delays. Now, going back to Kate Bishop, they did host a Marvel's Avengers War Table Deep Dive Kate Bishop video, and you can read from the description that it is coming out on December 8th, 2020, so we finally got a release date for that piece of content that was delayed from October. And looking at it, yeah, you can see that it is kind of your standard affair. It does add additional content and story beats. There's like time travel involved or something along those lines, and you can actually see a lot of gameplay from her sort of in this latter half of the video. And she does look potentially interesting to play, and I've said this in my review, I think the most interesting part of Marvel's Avengers is that the combat does seem to have some depth to it. It's just all of the other design elements surrounding the combat don't allow the combat to shine, is how I put it in my review, and it's something that I would still say. And it doesn't seem like it'll be too different with this content edition. You're still fighting a bunch of robots, and when you're fighting some of the bigger enemies, for example, you can't juggle them like you can with some of the weaker enemies, and when you're juggling these enemies, that's when combat really shines, but the game almost seems to be actively discouraging that with bullet spongy enemy types that are all too common in live service style games where, you know, levels and stats and damage are involved and numbers popping off of enemies as you attack them. And of course, there's going to be new cosmetics that they hope to sell via microtransactions. And there's also a Clint Barton piece of content that they've teased in this trailer here. And alongside Clint, we're being teased Maestro. Apparently, Clint goes to this post-apocalyptic future where he has to survive. That's where he finds Maestro. I don't know. I don't know how to feel about the whole time travel element that they're introducing now. What I'm looking for with superhero stories is the heart, the humanity underneath the mask, and that's what I thought Avengers was lacking, save for Kamala Khan, who had a bit of development but not enough. And then for the other Avengers, they almost felt like side characters, and it just feels like the story doesn't offer enough breathing room to really explore these characters' strengths and flaws. And so this just looks like a typical superhero plot, which is what Marvel's Avengers was, rather than something that will really be heartfelt. Seeing how unextraordinary the new content looks, like this doesn't look terrible, it just looks like the same generic game that we've already played, with a few new moves here and there and the like. But it's not going to be enough to bring back players. I think this is going to be great for people who do genuinely enjoy Marvel's Avengers now, but much like Anthem's Cataclysm and how that was advertised to be the big new piece of content, and how that wasn't nearly enough to bring back players, only to keep existing players momentarily happy, I get the sense that this is going to be in that ballpark. I've said this before, I think Marvel's Avengers core issue lies at its core. It's a very fundamental issue of being just so conceptually generic. It's such a typical live service that doesn't stand out from the pack, and the only thing that gives it any appeal, in my opinion, is the Avengers coat of paint. That's the only reason people are paying attention to this game. I feel like without the Avengers name, it would just be any old generic title, and that's what really kills it. The only thing carrying it is the brand, not the substance of the game, which is unfortunate because there's just so much potential for an Avengers game, AAA Avengers video game, especially if it were made with the right intention of creating the best experience for that IP, rather than trying to shove it into this generic live service mold that doesn't necessarily fit with this game or doesn't necessarily pave the road to the most compelling Avengers interactive experience. And I think a lot of people are recognizing that, and the addition of Kate Bishop and other heroes isn't gonna really do it. They really have to bolster the enemy variety, they have to make mission objectives more varied. They just have to make the game more fun to play, more things to do, and the activities actually have to feel engaging. But Marvel's Avengers, for me, unfortunately, is too mind-numbing, and I feel like a lot of people are finding this to be the case, which is why we're seeing such a rapid dip in player base, and even in the last few days, we are already seeing a 24-hour peak nosedive. And I suspect that will continue, though it'll be interesting to see after this new piece of content launches with Kate Bishop, whether that player base will rise and kind of remain steady, or if it'll kind of spike a little bit because people might be curious, and then it'll dip back down and that downwards trend will continue. And I have to question whether Marvel's Avengers will be able to get its shit together before the player base diminishes to a point where it's critical and the live service can essentially no longer survive because there aren't enough players fueling the multiplayer ecosystem, which is the core of this game. Time will tell, but in the meantime, let me know in the comments below what your thoughts and opinions are on Marvel's Avengers' diminishing player base and the war table detailing Kate Bishop, and whether for you seeing that new content rekindles your interest in the game, or if you're still in the camp of, nah, I'm done, I'm just gonna move on. So drop a comment, and to be further updated on all things gaming news, reviews, and discussions, stay tuned right here on Young Yeah. I'll see you guys next time. Young out.